Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Data-Driven Strategies for Winning with News Releases. I'm Hinda Shalou. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing with Business Wire, and I'm joined today with our partner, Dan Beltramo, the CEO of Unclusive. As you might be aware, Business Wire and Unclusive began a partnership earlier this year, and Unclusive is providing analytics for Business Wire's news releases. And so we underwent a little project with Unclusive about looking at news releases. And what we did was we anonymized about 15,000 news releases and ran them through Unclusive system to provide the basis of this webinar. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So if we can move on with the slides. As I said, I'm here with Dan Beltramo. So Dan will be talking to you in a minute. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction in terms of the content that Dan's going to share. And then Dan is going to take you through all of the data that Unclusive put together for us. So if we can move on, please. So we all know that the challenges that we face today is that there's so much information out there. There is all of the activity with digital media, influencers. The news is not just about the news, and it spreads more quickly, but we want to show you where and when it spreads, and that's the point of this webinar. So let's talk a little bit about how we can help you with some of the news releases. So at Business Wire, we see a number of different mistakes that we try, our editors work very, very hard to try to prevent from happening. So typos are one of the biggest things that we see when we look at news releases. And so we want to not only encourage you to make sure that there's no typos, but we will try to make sure that you have no typos. The other thing, and you'll see this in the data, is that multimedia is a really, really big asset when you're issuing your news release. A picture, a chart, a video, any information that enhances the written word really, really moves the needle on earned media. The other thing that we've learned, and again, this is where our editors try to help you, is poor grammar, use of jargon, too many acronyms definitely do not enhance getting earned media and follow-on articles with your news releases. And one of the most important things that we've heard from journalists is failure to put contact information on a release. This is something that might seem obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. And the other thing that we've learned in a best practice is that when you're putting out investor relations releases, we've heard from journalists time and again that you need to bullet out the items that you want them to highlight and use great tables so that they can see the data and it's a consistent set of information. A couple of other tips that we want to share with you are that the headline really needs to be clear. This shouldn't be a marketing type of subject line. It really should tell the journalist and the audience what's in the news release. The lead should give that nice summation of what's in it, and to ensure that you use a ticker symbol if you're a public company, a cash symbol is also great. And again, I'm just going to press the issue about multimedia. Make sure that your news releases are not a sales pitch. We've heard from journalists that they just simply want the facts. Give them clear, specific information to make sure that they're not guessing what this is about. And finally, what we want to talk about is the data. And so you want to make sure that you're measuring your information so that when you put out your next release, you're learning from every release that you're using. I wanted to show you, before I introduce Dan, what your news release looks like on our feed. And this is just to bring home the point about multimedia, which is, first of all, we do see a number of our clients who don't add a logo. And it's really, really essential so that the journalists can see your logo, see who you are. And when you don't have a logo, all you see is just a link. And so the second item is the logo itself. It makes it look a little bit better. But when you put in some multimedia, it really, really highlights that release. And again, this will bear fruit in Dan's description with the data. So this is just showing off our multimedia format, our interactive release, and all of our information that you can see. And you can see the right is our standard release. Our middle is our smart release, which is a single video or image. And our left is our interactive media. And again, we want to encourage you to use interactive media. All right. Dan, take it away.
All right, Hinda, thanks. It's great to be doing this with you. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm CEO of Onclusive. We've been working with Business Wire now for quite a while, analyzing their press releases. Onclusive was the first company to invent PR attribution, and as such, we've advanced the state of the art in PR analytics. Our whole platform is built on a proprietary news crawler, which captures, reads, and analyzes millions of earned, owned, and Newswire articles every day. And that's what gives us the power to do the analysis that we're about to present to you. And you'll start to see some of that data in the subsequent charts. Let me quickly talk about some of the questions that inspired this this whole analysis. And these are, I grew up in the marketing field and written a lot of press releases myself, but then during that process, there's always a series of questions that come up internally, such as, how do I get my release picked up by journalists? What's the best day of the week to put out our release? I've had many discussions on that topic internally myself. What time should we put out our release? How many earned media articles should we expect? How much social amplification should we expect? You know, how good is good? Or, you know, how well did this release do to another release, or variations of those questions? Should I pay more for special release features such as multimedia or broader distribution? This one always comes up. Is my release too long, too short? Should I cut out this paragraph? Whatever, you know, what's the right word count? And then how long should my headline be? These are all questions that I'm sure anybody on this call has wrestled with in one way or another, and we're going to do our best to address many or all of them. Next slide here. So this is a very robust study. I'm pretty sure it's by far the largest of its kind. So what we did, as Hinda indicated earlier, was analyze 15,000 news releases that came through Business Wire in the August, September, and October timeframe of this year, so it's very fresh. Importantly, we analyzed a mix of both public relations releases and investor relations releases. And by investor relations releases, I mean those that are mandated by law that public companies have to put out. So there's specific parameters around those, versus public relations releases or companies putting them out to convey information and gather stories and follow on coverage. Things that we looked at included investor relations versus public relations releases, and that's important. So what we didn't want to do is have people comparing the wrong kind of release with each other and missetting expectations. We also looked at syndication, and just to be clear on what syndication is, that's when your press release is repeated exactly on multiple other sites. We looked at social media amplification, and then we looked at, you know, what everybody is trying to achieve here, which is earned media articles that follow on from the release. So there's going to be a lot of data coming up. I kind of hit a few of these, but let me just kind of describe them in a little greater detail. So a syndicate, we kind of covered that. That's an exact republished version of a release. Social media engagement, for the purposes of this analysis, is the number of Twitter engagements, likes, comments, and shares of the news release in particular. It's not every little tweet about a company that follows a press release. It's tweets about the release itself. An earned media article is an article which has predominantly original content. The way we identify those, though, is to look for elements of a press release in the earned media content. That way we know that the earned media is tied back to a release. A PR release, as I mentioned, is one put out by the Public Relations Department, and an IR release is generally one put out by the IR team containing financial disclosures. All right, now we get into the data. Let's see. One of the things that you see here is that the number of syndicates varies dramatically per release, and this can be related to distribution and a number of other things. But the average number of syndicates per release is about 57. So when you see your release come up on a variety of different sites, on average, it's going to happen 57 times, and that can be a benchmark that you consider. All right. The other one is social media. Again, these are tweets of the release itself. So not just any tweet about your company, but during the first 7 days following the issuance of a release, there was an average of 23 tweets per release, with 12% of the releases not receiving any Twitter engagement. So, not everyone gets picked up on Twitter and generates a significant social media following.
So Dan, a question with regard to this is, does this discount releases tweets that are put out by the company, or does this include tweets that are included from the company?
I think some of these, it's hard for us to discern those because it's hard for us to know who's employed by the company or not. So it probably includes many tweets by the company itself. So some of that is manufactured, I assume, by the people putting out the releases. Okay,
great. And just as a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function on the menu, and we'll be happy to try to answer any and all of your questions that we can.
Yeah, thanks, and it'll make it a lot more interactive with the occasional question rather than running through a lot of numbers, because this is a heavily quantitative presentation. So optimizing for social media engagement. Given the power of social media and its potential reach, today's PR pros need to better maximize the socialization of their news. This study suggests that several factors can drive better social media amplification, starting with broader distribution. News releases distributed globally showed an average of 20% more social media amplification than releases distributed more narrowly. More distribution is correlated with more social engagement. That seems pretty straightforward. Perhaps more importantly, though, using multimedia assets in releases boosted social media amplification by an average of 12%. So Hinda kind of gave a preview of that, but it definitely does matter. Put your logo in there, put a little extra content, and makes it more engaging for social amplification.
So Dan, we had another question regarding social media, which is, do we only look at Twitter as a metric or all social platforms?
Not all social platforms make their data available externally. So we used a proxy here. We use Twitter as a proxy for social media. It's imperfect for certain certain releases, but it's the one that we can provide uniform data on, which is why we chose it for this this analysis. All right, good question. So earned media articles are what PR professionals hope their news releases and media relations generate. And according to the study, the average number of earned media articles each news release receives is 10. This number can vary depending on the company and the news being shared, and can be directly impacted by breaking news of the day. We found earned media articles in the hundreds for big companies with very newsy items like Apple launching an iPhone. However, the average can show, the average is around 10 per release. So high variance depending obviously on the newsworthiness of your article. And this one I found interesting because it's one that I've wrestled with in the past personally, but it does show that earned media coverage is correlated positively with the length of press releases. So while there's always quite a bit of pressure to keep your press releases, tight and pithy, and I wouldn't recommend against that at all, this would suggest that if you have something material to say, you don't need to worry too much about the word count, which is, as I said, often a point of discussion related to releases. Note that for this specific word count analysis, we did not separate investor relations from public relations releases. And IR releases tend to be the longer releases, the ones over 1,000 words. So, you can kind of look at this chart roughly as a proxy for PR releases and generally more coverage with more substance. All right. This chart is the chart that sort of the curiosity around this is what sparked this entire analysis. And the question here was, when do we put out our release that drove all of this? And we found that the most popular time for PR teams to post their news releases is Tuesday at 7 and 8 a.m. Eastern, with about 10 times more releases going out then than the average hour of the week. You'll also soon see that because this time is so popular, it can lead to the release being lost in the crowd. A couple of other points of reference. One is market hours in the United States are 9:30 to 4 East Coast time, and you can kind of see that reflected here in that most releases come out either right before the market opens or right before it closes, which can be probably attributed to companies either trying to somewhat minimize the coverage or to maximize the coverage by getting it out at the beginning of the day. Now, before I move on, this chart.
Dan, if I can interrupt with a question. So we have talked about this in the past, that we've all been taught to not send out a release on Monday and not send out a release on Friday. And so I don't think this data surprised us. Mm-mm. But what might you offer as a suggestion? You said a little bit of a change might make your release stand out from a crowd, but do you have a suggestion?
Yep, I think if it's not an investor relations release when it has to go out at a specific time, I think moving it, two things. One, moving it out at 7 or 8 o'clock a.m. Can make a difference, and then potentially not doing it right on the hour or right on the half hour. You're going to see that data a little bit later, but it's a good prelude to one of the other slides. So those are both things that you'll see coming up. There were a couple of things that I also wanted to say here because it will permeate many of the rest of the slides. Yep. One is that the amount of data for releases on Saturdays and Sundays is much smaller, obviously, than it is during the work week. So you will see some indices for those days that are a little bit outlying. And I will make some statements about them, but I want everybody to know that there's smaller sample sizes there and therefore potentially more statistical variance. And the other thing I would like to do is explain to people how to read these charts, because looking at a chart with 168 numbers on it can be daunting. So we've done a couple of things to make it easier to interpret it. One is these charts are indices, so they're indexed to 100. So the average hour of the week would have a 100 in there. So, 1 p.m. on Wednesday has 110. That means 10% more releases go out during that hour than the average hour of the week. More interestingly, there, 8 a.m. on Tuesday has 10 times as many releases going out relative to the average hour of the week. So 100 is average, 200 is 2 times average, 30 is 30% of average. So I just want to make it really clear so people can interpret the rest of these charts relatively quickly. The other thing that we did is we colored the charts. So the darker the green, the more positive variance there is. So that, that index of 1045 or 10x is dark green. and the lighter the color it is corresponds to below average scores. So that allows you to go through the numbers and the charts really quickly. All right. So on this chart, it's important to know that the most popular days and times for news release distribution are not necessarily the most effective at generating syndication, social media engagement, and earned media coverage. You can see that at 7 and 8 a.m., where syndication is somewhat lower, you can see that at 7 and 8 a.m. syndication is somewhat lower, suggesting that publishers might be getting overwhelmed at those times. If you think back to the prior chart where we had tons of releases going out at 7 and 8 a.m. Eastern time, you can see on this chart right here, I'm going to move the cursor around, these slightly lower indices of 70 and 80% suggest that there's slightly below average syndication by putting out your release at those times. On the flip side, if you go to hours other than those times, particularly later in the evening, you can sometimes get higher than average syndication. So if your objective is to maximize syndication, consider not going when everybody else goes. That's a key takeaway that I wanted to share with folks. And let me see if there's anything else.
Well, Dan, I just want to remind the audience of what the syndication is, which is an exact duplication of your release. It's not earned media. It's just simply an exact duplication.
Right.
And so if that's what you're looking for, you might consider moving your times around. I think what we've also thought about with regard to the syndicates is the syndicates might send out those exact duplicates at other times specifically because they want the information that's flowing through to move at a different time. So that's a possibility too.
Possibility. Yep. So Hinda, thanks. And there are two other things I wanted to state about this chart. One is that there's relatively low variance overall. If you look at the indices across the bottom here on days of the week, it's plus or minus 10%. And even on the hours, you're getting sort of plus or minus, maybe minus 10% to plus 50% in some narrow cases. So effectively what this is saying is, the main takeaway is no matter when you run your release, you're going to get a good amount of syndication on Business Wire. They're driving the syndication. They're doing their job for you at any hour of the day. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that when looking at this chart and subsequent charts, it's important to know that the numbers you see in each box are tied to the releases that went out during that time period. In this case, the numbers do not show the number of syndicates that were published in a particular hour, but rather the relative amount of syndication that occurred for releases that went out during that hour. So, what this is saying, just to repeat it in one more time, is that the releases that went out in the 7 or 8 a.m. timeframe had less overall syndication than ones that went out at other times. And I'll kind of harken back to that on a couple of other slides just to remind folks. All right, volume of social media engagement. This basically shows that social media engagement is associated with greater volumes of releases. I wouldn't say there's too much really surprising data here. More releases go out in the 7 to 8 a.m. timeframe or 3 p.m. timeframe, and therefore there's more social engagement. It's a fairly straightforward one. However, when indexed as an average against the number of releases overall, the rate of social media engagement is actually best for releases that go out in the later hours of 1, 5, 7, and even 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. Also, the study shows that social media amplification for all kinds of press releases is greater for weekend releases. This aligns with the mobile journey, highlighting times when people have more time to discover, consider, and share, i.e. lunchtime, commute time, and after hours. So people do see these articles come through when they have a little bit of downtime, and that's when you're often most likely to maximize social engagement. So again, we're giving you a lot of considerations here. Do you want to maximize social engagement? Do you want to maximize syndication? Do you want to maximize follow-on media coverage, which I believe is the next slide. And this, in many regards is the holy grail. These are articles written by third parties about the content that you put out on the wire. So the best days to put out news releases to generate earned media articles are Tuesdays and Fridays. And although the indices appear high on Saturdays and Sundays, there is more statistical variance on those days. So it's harder to draw firm conclusions. So you can see the, on Saturday at the bottom, that 501 is a very high indice, and on Sunday it's very low, but there's also much less data to draw from. It's also thought that Tuesday is the better day for general releases, and Fridays may work best for stories that are less about hard news, perhaps because journalists have more time at the end of the week or over the weekend to consider such items. Again, the determining factor is likely newsworthiness, which is always the case. It seems, just on that chart, to go back one, it does seem that we have primed the market to expect a bunch of releases on Tuesday, so it's geared up to write articles on Tuesday, and then they digest what came through for the next couple of days, and they have a little bit more capacity on Friday to do to retackle articles. That's just my color commentary on that.
Well, it will be interesting to see, Dan, if people started to move when they publish their releases, how this would change over time. So we'll probably have to look at it and see if people move their releases from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and see how this is affected. I think that would be interesting.
Yep, I think there's definitely some follow-on work to be done here. Thanks, Cinda. According to the research, the most popular individual hour for investor relations news releases to go out is 3 p.m. on Wednesdays. So, for that specific hour right before the market closes. But there's also big pushes at 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. early in the week. And those 7 and 8 a.m., if combined, are bigger than 3 o'clock. This timing may reflect whether companies are trying to move the market with their results or trying to avoid that movement. So this is relatively straightforward and not too unexpected. So now these are investor relations releases. That's just to highlight that these are not sort of PR releases. And what we see is the most syndicates of investor relations releases are driven by releases that come out on Fridays and Mondays. And the study narrows down the most effective times being 6 p.m. and onward. So if you look at the bottom, I like to look at the bottom row often. You see that 103 index on Mondays, and you see a 125 index on Fridays. So those are the peaks. Now, I will also say, like I said, for one of the other charts, that there isn't a lot of variance here during the work week. So, predominantly your IR releases are going to get very similar amounts of syndication any day of the week you put them out. Although Fridays does seem to be a much stronger day. So again, probably because less people do it there.
Dan, there was a question that came up, so I just want to make the statement that what we're talking about and what you're talking about in terms of timing is Eastern time. So yes. I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks for that, Hinda. It's up in the top left, but it's not easy to see. So that's a good call out. Thanks for that. Cool. And then investor relations, tweets per release indexed. When timing your investor relations releases, Tuesdays and Fridays are the best days for issuing to issue for maximizing the rate of social media amplification, with midday being the best time of day. So again, this corresponds a little bit to the data that we've seen. If your IR release is intended to generate social media follow-on, which it may or may not be, again, putting it at times where people have a little bit of time to be on their social devices and mobile devices does help, in particular, in this case, kind of the lunch hour.
So Dan, this was a little bit different than the PR releases, and so were the syndicates. Is there any correlation that you could draw the difference between PR releases and IR releases in terms of some of these indices?
Yeah, well, I think IR releases, there's much more mandate about when they happen. There's much more expectation about when they're going to happen, and people are primed for them to come out at specific times. So I think the behavior patterns are much more pronounced with IR releases. You know, when they come out, they tend to be, you know, that super heavy index in the morning and super heavy index around 3 right before the market goes out. And they're very much concentrated in the middle of the week where, and during work hours. And there are probably some laws about that. I'm not 100% sure, but I guess that to be the case. Whereas the press release is just much wider variance all over the time of day, time of week, and so forth. So I think a lot of it is just financial market driven for the investor relations releases. That's a good question. Thank you, Hinda. This chart is one of my favorite charts, and it was something that Hinda, prior to crunching the data, had some insight about. But you know, if you dive deeper into timing, the data also shows that the 30-minute mark, it shows that at the 30-minute mark, the volume of releases is just 30% of the volume of releases posted exactly on the hour. For releases at the 15 or 45-minute mark, that volume drops to between 5 and 10%, improving the likelihood of any single release being seen. The only outlier from the 15-minute increments is for releases posted 5 minutes past the hour. All hour minutes within the hour do not combine to a statistically relevant percentage, all other minutes. So what you see here is that the vast majority of releases go right out on the hour. Some people have embraced what Hinda's recommendation and what you often hear from Business Wire is go a little bit off the hour. So a few people are going 5 minutes after the hour, and then people tend to go, you know, on the 15-minute increments. So I do believe that Hinda is correct with that recommendation to go, you know, 5, 6, 7 minutes after the hour when things aren't so swamped, because they're.
Well, I mean, this is your opportunity for differentiation in a really, you know, big way, right? If everybody's sending it out at the top of the hour or on the 30 minutes, then your release is going to get crunched by the journalists and might not get the exposure. So rather than the 5s, maybe the 12s or the 13s or the 42s might work. So just something for everybody to try. And testing is always something that we invite you to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's a very straightforward, easy to implement as well.
So I think that leads us into sort of the summary of what we've learned today. And I think that Dan and the Inclusive team did a really terrific job of taking the releases and going through them and trying to come up with some ways in which you can change just some small things to perhaps change the metrics that you're getting. And so I think what you saw is that depending upon the type of release and your company and the day of the week, performance is different. And that public relations releases and investor relations releases definitely perform differently. We would suggest that you consider doing things a little bit differently. So if you don't have a hard news item, but maybe you're running a sale, as an example, if you're a retail company and you're running a sale, perhaps sending out your release on a Friday afternoon or a Saturday morning when people are going out to the store, that might pay off given that there's social interaction, and that might help your coverage. As Dan said earlier, when you're looking at the length of your release, it might be helpful to add a couple of words to help explain what's in the release. Remember, what journalists want to see are really the facts, and they're not looking for a sales pitch. We can't say it enough. Adding multimedia, whether it be a picture, a video, a graph, a chart, or interactive media, which is really better, that's going to help you get better coverage. And again, what journalists will say about this is don't give them a sales pitch, give them the facts. And so your multimedia and pictures should really be about giving them the facts. And that what we've seen is broader distribution does correlate with more social interaction. And so for those of you who work for a company that is a global brand, considering sending your release globally, because perhaps that helps get you more social interaction. And, you know, we can't stress this enough, but testing your messaging and testing your headlines much as the same way as you test your marketing could absolutely change the impact of your release. Because again, what journalists are looking for is that information that is in the headline and then in the lead to give them the impetus to move forward. And of course, it's not only sending it over the wire, but it is, of course, building that relationship with that journalist to give them the reason to write about you and to continue to feed them with more information. And for those of you who use Business Wire, where you see this information is in your news track report. And this is a screenshot of what the news track report shows you. And you can see very clearly that you'll be able to see the volume of social media engagement. You'll be able to see the sentiment analysis, as well as all of your earned and syndicated media, as well as who's picking it up internationally. So you'll be able to see that as well. So that's in your news track report. So we have a white paper that is part of this, and you will be able to download the white paper after this. I'll also open up the time for any additional questions that anybody might have. So again, use the chat box or the Q&A box. If you have any additional questions, we're happy to answer them. So I'll give it a minute for that. And otherwise, I think that Dan and the Inclusive team did a fantastic job of analyzing all of this information. And a question came in, Dan, about breaking this down by industry. And I'm wondering whether or not
that's a great. Yeah, Hinda, that was something that, you know, this was our first pass at it, and we were so excited with the results and the data that came out of it. We wanted to get it out, but there are, yeah, some improvements or additional cuts that we could make like that, and we would be excited to do that, and may very well do that. So that's a good. So the answer is I don't have any industry by industry insights right now, but it is something that would be a very sensible piece of analysis to run in the future.
Okay. And another question is about how do we handle data on international releases? So
we can run this analysis for international releases as well. As you know, Business Wire is a very global organization. Well, I mean, as you, Hinda, obviously know, but for people on the line, Business Wire has a broad coverage internationally, and Inclusive also tracks media mentions and media monitoring internationally. So that's also in our capabilities, but again, it's just another rev and another webinar waiting to happen.
And then another question is a reminder, people were asking about what the index, if you can perhaps go back on one of those slides and define the index.
Yeah, we'll roll back to one of those so I can talk through it. Maybe we'll roll back to the first one that had let's see, let's get there. This one. Yep, this is a great one. So what I'll describe what these indices show. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, it says 100, and that's sort of the average number of releases that go out in an hour was indexed to the number 100. That way, rather than just showing you lists of numbers that went out at any given time, you can quickly see the relative differences in hours. So 100 is average. If you see a box with 100 in it, that hour is average for the whole week. A box with the number 200 in it has twice as many releases going out as an average hour, and a box with the number, say, 28 in it has 28% of the average hour. So what we did is we indexed everything to the average hour on this chart for the number of releases going out, and then all the rest of the charts are like that as well, in that we index to the average amount of social media amplification, or the average amount of earned media coverage that you get. And that way it allows people to compare the hours much more easily rather than lists of actual numbers. And also, and then just as a reminder, we color coded these things. So if it's green or darker green, it means it's above average. The darker the green, the more above average. And if it's white or super light green, that's more below average scores.
Thank you. So we had a question about sweeps week and how we track those numbers in sweeps week. I would imagine it doesn't change, except it's just more, but I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, I don't think it would change. We could at some point isolate the analysis to individual weeks to see if different weeks of the year behave different than other weeks. So, what you're seeing here is a composite of everything that happened, over those 15,000 releases over that 3-month period. It is conceivable that, during specific weeks, sweeps weeks, or, high earnings release weeks, that there's slightly different behavior. And, at the end of the year, when we have a full year of data under our belt, that would also be a good piece of analysis to run. So I appreciate these questions because they're basically prompting the next list of questions for us to ask and analyze.
Absolutely. Another question was, are we showing B2B and B2C releases? And I think the answer is yes, because these were just 15,000 anonymized releases. So they're a combination of both.
Yeah, we did not filter for type of company. And that would probably eventually, if we do the industry analysis that somebody else suggested, might be another way to do it as well.
Another question, somewhat related but unrelated, was about the content and interactive media and some best practices that we've seen aside from including them. So here are some of the best practices with interactive media. So first of all, you want to be able to tell a story, and your interactive content should be about the story that you're trying to tell within your press release. What we've heard from the media is if you want them to use this, using a video that is sort of a how-to video or a descriptor type of video is more interesting to them than sort of a sales pitch. However, if you're using interactive media as a, shall we say, a mini landing page, then it might be more sales oriented, and whereby the media would likely pick up a picture or a chart that is part of your interactive media. So those are some of the things for you to think about with regard to interactive media. Tell a story, ensure that your assets are part of that story, consider it as part of your campaign. If you want the media to pick it up, consider your video to be a how-to type of video or an explanatory type of video. And so those are some of the insights that we can give you about interactive media.
That makes sense.
Anything that you wanted to add with regard to that, Dan?
No, but the one thing I did want to add is I was thinking about that B2B and B2C question right before. And my supposition is that most of the stuff you see happening on the weekends is more the B2C stuff that might have to do with retailers or consumer oriented announcements when people are going shopping and so forth. So, and that, almost all of the IR stuff is happening during the middle of the week. So there is definitely some analysis to be done there, but yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out.
And this is another question. I'm not sure that we looked at this, but did we notice whether or not releases performed better on the general wire versus a trade-specific wire? So I'll let you answer, but I'm not sure that we looked at that.
We didn't do that, and I think that would correspond to that industry analysis that's begging to be done. Yeah.
Okay.
So we did not separate. The only thing that we did there is, we looked at global releases, and there did seem to be more correlate. The broader the release, the more coverage, which isn't too surprising. But we didn't break it down by industry segment.
Well, Dan, I really appreciate you taking the time to present this webinar with me. Just as follow-up, we will send out the slides for the webinar, and you can download the white paper by the end of the week on Inclusive, or you can get it from Business Wire as well. Thank you for joining us today. We are grateful for your participation. These were some of the best questions that I think that we've entertained on a webinar. And Dan and I both wish everybody happy holidays, and thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.